All right, so today we're cracking open a really unusual case file. This is basically a presentation given by a figure called the Puppet King to his ministers of shame, and the subject, a troublemaker he calls the Jester. So let's dive into this and really try to unpack the king's incredibly grim worldview. Wow, okay, right out of the gate, the king lays his cards on the table. From his point of view, the very thing we cherish, our own unique identity, our sense of I, it's not some precious gift. He sees it as a disease, a malignant fever. And his entire mission, his whole reason for being, is to cure this sickness. So in his own mind, he's not a tyrant, he's a doctor. So where is this cure for the fever of individuality administered? Well, it happens inside his kingdom, a place he calls the Mausoleum of Stasis. Let's take a closer look at what that actually means. You really have to pay attention to the words he's using here. His kingdom isn't just a kingdom. He thinks of it as a laboratory. The whole point is to surgically remove what he calls the terror of being. You know, all the anxiety, the drive, the ambition that make us who we are. The end state he's aiming for is the perfect, quiet peace of a graveyard. It's a comfortable kind of non-existence.
And this tells you everything about the king's role in his own system. See, he doesn't see himself as a king in the way we'd think of one. He's more like a function, an empty space. He's the absolute not I, a vacuum designed to just absorb all the messy, unpredictable energy of individuality, to just swallow that chaotic light. So, with the scene set in his silent kingdom, the king now turns his cold, analytical gaze toward the big problem, the one fever he just can't seem to break, the jester. The king defines the jester's whole deal as the absolute Ich. Now, Ich is just German for I. So what we're talking about is the absolute self, an identity that makes its own rules, creates its own meaning, and doesn't need anyone's approval. But to the king, that kind of self-reliance isn't freedom. It's the very thing that causes all the chaos, the frenzy he's trying to get rid of. And this gets us right to the heart of their conflict. This isn't just a political disagreement, it's an ontological war, a war over what it even means to exist. You've got the king on one side, aiming for total stillness, the death of ambition, where the grave is the ultimate ruler. And on the other side, you've got the jester, pushing for constant change, the will to power, where the self is the ultimate ruler. These two ideals simply can't exist in the same space. The king then just coldly lists the jester's weapons, and you can almost hear the contempt in his voice. He doesn't see active laughter as joy, it's a weapon. A rhythmic assault is an attack on his perfect silence. The zero flame and the chipped axe, they're just attempts to tear down history and order. To the king, these are the pathetic, desperate tools of a fool trying to breathe life back into a world that, as far as he's concerned, is already dead and buried. Now the king turns to the jester's own personal story, but he frames this supposed evolution not as some kind of heroic growth, but as a completely predictable and ultimately totally pointless cycle of rebellion. So the king actually borrows a famous philosophical idea here, the three metamorphoses. First, the camel, who carries the heavy weight of the past, then the lion, who violently rejects it, and finally the child, who tries to create something totally new. But the king's take is just dripping with cynicism. He calls the whole thing a reactor's delusion. He's saying the jester is only ever reacting to the history and the silence that the king himself represents. He isn't actually free, he's still on a leash. And there it is. That's his final word on it. The jester's laughter, his rebellion, his creative spark, to the king, it's all just a futile scream. Sure, it makes a lot of noise for a minute, but he is absolutely certain that in the end, the crushing silence of his cemetery, that inevitable pull of decay, is just going to swallow it whole. In this next section, the king really lays out the strategy of this war, comparing his own subtle, creeping methods with the jester's loud and, in his opinion, totally ineffective tactics. You know, what's so interesting here is that, in a way, both of them are nihilists. The jester represents active nihilism. He wants to tear down the old rules to make space for new ones. But the king? He's all about passive nihilism. He doesn't have to destroy a thing. He just needs to convince everyone to give up, to let their will just surrender to nothingness. His strategy is one of patient, managed decay. And look at the contrast in their forces. The jester is out there fighting all alone as the solitary Ich. But the king,
Oh, the king has agents, his tarantula preachers, and they carry out his mean strategy, something he calls the Great Flattening. So, how does this flattening actually work? It's not brute force, it's way more subtle, and frankly, a lot more insidious. His ministers, these preachers, they don't use violence, they weave webs of stagnant peace. They use guilt and a warped sense of equality to make sure no one rises above the crowd, that any little spark of individual greatness gets snuffed out immediately. It's a pretty brilliant and terrifying strategy for keeping everything perfectly still.
And so we reach the king's closing arguments. He's laid out his philosophy, analyzed his enemy, and detailed his strategy. Now he delivers his final, chillingly confident verdict on how this war will end.
The king's ultimate prize isn't a crown or a bigger kingdom. It's a moment, an event. He calls it the final sunset. It's a kind of permanent twilight where all striving, all ambition, every bit of motion is finally and permanently stopped. The fever of being is broken, and the patient can finally rest. And this isn't some random conquest either. It's a methodical, four-step process. First, you paralyze society's activity, its commerce. Then, you just let the collective soul rot, lose its drive. Once that rot sets in, you extinguish any last sparks of ambition. And the final step? You achieve the grave, the perfect silent kingdom.
And that's really the bottom line for the king. True power, true sovereignty, isn't about ruling over millions of people. It's about getting to a state where the very idea of an individual I just doesn't exist anymore. For him, peace is the complete and total cure of the self. The king ends his whole analysis with this rhetorical question for his ministers. And for him, of course, the answer is obvious. Silence is absolute victory. But as we close this case file, that question just kind of hangs there, doesn't it? In a war that's about existence itself, what does it really mean to win? Is the perfect absence of all struggle a triumph, or is it just the ultimate defeat?